everyone, welcome to this week's Science Roundup. After the amazing meeting last week on sex and gender differences, we're going to get back to some other science. Specifically, 3 very high-impact studies that were published recently. They cover different areas of research, from genetics to epidemiology to intervention. But they all have one thing in common. They all have the ability to potentially change the way people think about autism. The first one is a landmark study looking at over 15,000 DNA samples whose exomes were sequenced. The exome is the part of the genome that codes for proteins. It constitutes about 1% of the entire genome, but because this is the part of the genome that codes for proteins, mutations in this part are more likely to have severe consequences than the other 99%. This technology, exome sequencing, has been really helpful in finding de novo mutations that have been recently shown to be so important in autism. De novo means that this particular mutation wasn't found in either parent, but was found in the individual with autism. What this study found, which was led by Joe Buxbaum, a member of the ASF-SAB, was both reassuring and surprising. Reassuring because the study reiterated the role of genes that have been previously shown to be associated with ASD. So these are genes that animal models have been developed around and companies are working on new drugs for. What was surprising is when they grouped these different genes together in different categories, they identified 3 different, what they called clusters. They were chromatin remodeling, which I'll discuss in a minute, 2, transcription, and this just means that the proteins that are made out of the genetic code, and the 3rd, synaptic function. This last one, synaptic function, is how the ends of neurons communicate with each other. And again, these synaptic function genes have been found in other studies, so this was a part that was reassuring. They were found again. But what was surprising was this chromatin remodeling genes. So let's go back to that first group of genes, the chromatin remodeling genes. It controls a lot, this chromatin. It's a molecule that ties up DNA and keeps it grouped together like in a circle. If you laid out all of your DNA in all of your cells, which is trillions, in a line, it would stretch out to the moon. I know you think I must be exaggerating about that, but it's true. So if it needs to be wrapped up or stuffed into each cell, it still needs to be decoded. And that's what chromatin does. So if chromatin isn't doing its job, things are not going on properly in gene expression. What's especially interesting about chromatin is it's susceptible to epigenetic factors. And this is the way that genes in the environment interact. So it's promising that chromatin could be affected by environmental exposures. Do you know how long the scientific community has been looking to show how genes in the environment interact in autism? What genes are involved that could possibly serve as susceptibility sites? When we think about environmental exposures and factors, we think about them broadly. Anything from stress to pharmaceuticals, hormones, early life exposures, and toxicants. So clearly more studies need to be done, but what's exciting is this is a prime candidate to study how environment affects genetic expression. Okay, on to the next study. I know I keep harping on early intervention, but a new study came out that's really great. Amy Weatherby's group at Florida State, together with Kathy Lord's group at the Center for Autism and the Developing Brain in New York, looked at the effectiveness of parent-mediated intervention in toddlers younger than 24 months. If you've been following along, you know that early intervention is the most effective method to improve autism symptoms over time. I can already hear a bunch of you yelling back at me, "That's great. I don't have any EI providers in my area. They're not covered by my insurance, and the waiting lists are insanely long." Well, good news. This study shows that in the right situations, parents can be effective implementers of early intervention at their own homes. Parents of infants and toddlers spend tons of time with their children. However, it's usually in environments that aren't normally thought of as intervention moments. Using a type of intervention that focused on social communication and emotional regulation, children of parents who were trained and coached to deliver the intervention at home had a better outcome than those parents who participated in a 1-week group session. These contexts were places like the grocery store, during bath time, or when cooking a meal. Both groups improved over time, but the kids whose parents got at-home coaching did a bit better. I want to stress that these results are not to be used to replace clinician time or to burden parents with added responsibility of providing intervention at home. So we need to remember that parents are there to incorporate skills into different environments, not take over completely. This isn't the same kind of session, which I know many of you out there have encountered, where you watch what the therapist does in an office and then he or she turns to you and says, okay, now do this at home, as if it's that easy. In this model, parents are given coaching and feedback tips in real-life settings. This model can increase the number of hours a child is receiving intervention. And we all know, with all the work being done around early detection and identification, it's important to have interventions that are accessible. If you want to see some examples of this intervention in action, go to the Autism Speaks video glossary. There's a whole section under treatment where you can see these, or you can go to esi.fsu.edu. Finally, I know I promised you an epidemiology study, so here it is. This one's a new study out of Denmark that looks at why there was an increase in prevalence in autism in the past 30-some years. This has been a big question on everyone's mind. Has it been the environment? Is it diagnostic practices? Is it better detection? A few years ago, a study in California showed that better diagnosis and awareness accounted for about 50% of this rise in prevalence. This brand new study out of Denmark shows that it's as high as 60%. This sort of analysis can only be done with very large sample sizes, so Denmark, with their 3,000 births and 2,000 autism diagnoses per year, all put into a centralized health register, is a perfect way to track this. The researchers picked years to study based on the fact that the diagnosis methods of autism in Denmark changed in 1994. And then in 1995, the registry included outpatient diagnoses. So there were these two really good opportunities to study diagnosis and reporting practices on prevalence. Of course, these findings may not generalize to the entire world, but it does tell us a lot about what may be going on. While that 60% number does explain a lot, it doesn't explain everything. And let's remember that there's still 40% of the increase in prevalence that still remains unexplained. It's not one or the other. I know this is one of the more controversial and divisive areas of research, and it's easy to grab on to one number or the other, but these results show that there's room for both sides of the table. Thanks for joining us this week. If you missed last week's recap of the Sex and Gender Differences in Autism workshop, be sure to check it out. Have a great weekend and stay tuned next week for more updates.